Welcome back. This week we are shifting back to West Africa from East Africa, and we're talking about the opening of Atlantic trade. So, as you can see from the dates on the screen there, roughly 1450 to about 1600 for this early period of the establishment of Atlantic trade. Um, what we're talking about really also is what historians often refer to as the creation of the Atlantic world. Seeing these continents that, are of course separate continents, but seeing them now as linked together as they will be, 1450, certainly from 1500 onward, with Europe, especially southwestern Europe, West and West Central Africa, South America, the Caribbean, and North America. And I think the importance here is, well, as it always is in history, what changes it's going to bring, right? Because history is about change. But it's also about seeing the Atlantic in a different way, where I think prior to about 1500 or so, the Atlantic was seen as a barrier that prevented contact between peoples. But after about 1500, though, it's more like a highway, which facilitates connection rather than preventing it. So we're really going to see the development of, well, really what we refer to today as globalization happening during this time period, and connections between all these people who are bordered on the Atlantic here. What in your textbook talks about this some, so I'll just do it somewhat briefly here. What really gets things going is ocean-going exploration by the Portuguese, people from the country of Portugal, right here, in just above Morocco, in far southwestern Europe. And they started in the 14th century, so the 1300s, exploring the ocean around them, something they hadn't really done before, which seems a little odd, but anyway, they were busy doing other things. But anyway, so they're going to start sending ships out into the ocean, just exploring the ocean around them. And as you can see on this map here, they're going to find things they didn't know were there before. They'll discover the islands of Madeira here in 1420, the Azores in 1427, and what becomes known as the Canary Islands in 1460. So they're going to start sailing out further and further, and they'll go a little bit further than the previous vessel, come back, go further, come back, and so on. And part of that is going to be going off into the Atlantic this way, but it's also going to be going down the African coast. And they didn't know much about Africa until much later, actually. So this is going to be a gradual period. As you see, well, you see here, it's 1420, 1427, 1460. That takes decades. It takes decades to do that. They're going to be down here along the Gambia River in 1455. By 1470, they're along the Gold Coast in West Africa here. 1480s here, and it's going to be the 1490s before they make it all the way around Africa over into the Indian Ocean. So as I said, it's going to take decades of incremental change. Going a little further, coming back, going a little further, coming back. Now, students often ask, why is it the Europeans were coming to Africa and it wasn't Africans going to Europe? Well, it wasn't the Europeans even coming to Africa, once again, until about the 1450s, because of what you see on this map here, which is the ocean currents and wind systems. Because the fact is, the currents, and Portugal's right here once again in southwestern Europe here, and the ocean currents, I know we think of the ocean just kind of like as this large bathtub or something, but it's actually a very dynamic thing. And the prevailing ocean currents go from the north, or by Portugal here, to the southwest and to the south. So it's possible then to ride what's known as the Canary Current by the Canary Islands here, or the Guinea Current down here, and to go down the coast. Those same strong ocean currents, though, make it very difficult, if not impossible, for people along the West African coast to go up. It also made it impossible for the Portuguese and other Europeans to go down the coast and also come back up, until much later in time, when they found out you could go down the coast, then sail out into the middle of the Atlantic, and then catch these wind systems and these wind currents that'll take them back to Europe this way. So in a sense, it was a triangular sort of trip. They would go down the coast, wherever they wanted to go in Africa, then off into the Atlantic, and then back over into Europe. All right? And these are the same ocean currents and wind systems that they're going to use to travel to the Americas. And by Americas, I mean all the Americas: South America, Caribbean, Meso or Central America, and North America. All right? Now, one point I want to make that I think is often misunderstood is that when the Europeans start traveling down the African coast, they are, attacking Africans sometimes and raiding, but after a time, they're going to start just conducting peaceful trade. In those early years, so 1450 to 1600 or so, most of that early trade was not a slave trade. Okay, it was not purchasing enslaved Africans or raiding for them or anything. It was a commodity trade. And I think you see that most clearly in the primary source you have for this week, the English of Benin. The English show up at the Kingdom of Benin, what is today actually in western part of the country of Nigeria, and you read the whole document. There's no mention at all in there about slaves. They're not coming to pursue a slave trade. They're coming to buy pepper. Okay, so it's so it's important to realize that a lot of the early trade was a commodity trade. And what we see happening, and you can see on this graph over time, is that will change. But even up to about 1680, almost half of the exports from Africa by value here were commodities, were items. And that includes gold, ivory, pepper, types of wood, hides and skins, all sorts of natural products from Africa that Europeans are coming down to purchase. It's only really about 1700 onward that we're going to see, we'll see here in just a minute, which are going to be the main years of the Atlantic slave trade. Okay? So although Atlantic trade starts in about the 1450s, the major years of the Atlantic slave trade are about 1700 to about 1850. So of the 500 or so years of Atlantic trade, the Atlantic slave trade dominates for about 150 out of those 500 years. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that means it's not important, because it was obviously very important. But it's just not the only thing going on. Okay? All right. I will put this link on the agenda, but it's a time lapse where you can see the Atlantic slave trade showing these dots across the Atlantic in 2 minutes time, and I find it actually quite moving. And you see how slowly it is to get started at the beginning, but by the time you get past 1700, how quickly it moves along. Okay. Now, to talk about the Atlantic slave trade, it's important, I think, to understand a few things. Let's illustrate that by taking a look at this map here. What this map shows is, well, not just the Atlantic slave trade, but actually a number of different slave trades out of Africa, including from the Swahili coast to Asia, and from It's not out of Africa necessarily, but from parts of sub-Saharan West Africa into and across the Sahara, for example. But we're going to focus on the Atlantic world here today. But what you see then are, first off, a number of locations along the Atlantic coast of Africa, which were the points of origin for enslaved Africans and slave ships as they would leave the continent. And now these are regions as they were discussed by people at the time, so in the 18th, 19th century and so on. Senegambia, so this area of what is today Senegal and Gambia up here, Sierra Leone, the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa. All right. On the other side then are the destinations where enslaved Africans were taken, including Brazil and areas of South America, Mesoamerica, primarily Mexico, points in the Caribbean, and then North America in those territories that primarily British colonies that would become the United States. Now, the other thing this meant, well, and also a small number up over here directly to Europe that your textbook talks about. Now, the other thing that this map shows is it shows by the width of these arrows the relative number of people taken out of different places in Africa and the relative number taken to different places in the Americas. So the thicker this arrow, the greater number of people. So you can tell then as we look at the coast of Africa here on the Atlantic coast, the largest single point of origin for Africans being taken out of the continent was West Central Africa here. The largest single destination was Brazil. Almost the same size as Brazil, almost the same number of people would be, whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. Let's go back here. Would be the Caribbean as a whole, but this breaks it down into different destinations, right? So the major point of origin for people taken out of Africa was West Central Africa, and the major place they went was Brazil. There's a couple of easy explanations for why that would be. Number one is you had a slave trade into Brazil for essentially the longest period of time. It was one of the first places that enslaved Africans were taken to, and it was one of the last places they were taken to. So you had a slave trade over here that went on for over 400 years. Right? Secondly, both these territories were, at least until 1822 or so, under some control of the Portuguese. So it was the Portuguese basically trading kind of with themselves here, from one Portuguese area to another. Right? And then finally, as you can see on this map, the distance from West Central Africa to Brazil is relatively short. It takes a ship sailing from West Central Africa going to Brazil only about 3 weeks to cover this distance. And I say only about 3 weeks because a ship coming from one of these places up here, Bight of Benin, Bight of Biafra, for example, and going to the Caribbean would be 4 or 5 weeks. And another 6 weeks or so, excuse me, another 6 weeks or so, oh, not another 6 weeks, a total of 6 weeks or so up to the United States. Well, because the shipping time is, the distance is shorter, the shipping time is shorter here, it means it's cheaper because the transport costs are lower. So it's cheaper to ship slaves from West Central Africa to Brazil. Matter of fact, it's so much so that if you learned anything about the Atlantic slave trade, maybe in U.S. history, and you saw a diagram of the triangular trade, and you're probably told that ships went from Europe to Africa and then to the Americas and back. But that's not the case down here. Actually, there was a separate slave trade where the ships just went back and forth between Brazil and Africa, right here. Okay, but as I said, slave vessels, say, leaving Senegambia or Sierra Leone, and especially going to the United States, would take 5 or 6 weeks. Now, it doesn't look like that would be the case, because from here to here looks like it's actually not that long either. But ships can't sail directly from Senegambia to the United States, or they couldn't back then. Why not? Well, once again, because of these ocean currents and wind patterns. If you leave Senegambia right here, you get caught up in this Guinea current, and you have to go all the way down the coast, and usually end up down here around Sao Tome. Then you have to drop below the equator, pick up these currents up here, and come back up across this way, and then come up through the Caribbean. And then, if you're, a lot of ships stopping in the Caribbean then, but if your ultimate destination is North America, then up through North America. So it's coming down here, dropping down here, coming up through here, threading your way between the islands of the Caribbean here, and then up to North America. So if you know anything about slavery or about the Atlantic slave trade, it's probably from a U.S. history class. And it's probably, I don't want to say it's wrong, but it's probably not representative of most of the experiences here, because North America was a relatively small part of what was going on. Also, the system of slavery in North America was quite a bit different than it was in other places as well. Okay, let's go back here. Okay. All right. So, okay, so we've got this map here. Now, this map shows something very similar. The difference with this map, and I hope you're not looking at this on your phone because it's very hard to see. Okay? You need a larger monitor here. But the difference on this map is it shows the same points of origin, it shows same destinations, but it's just got a lot more detail. Okay, so for example, instead of one arrow into Brazil, it breaks it down in different places in Brazil. Southeast Brazil, Bahia, Pernambuco, Amazonia. Okay, so we've got these different spots. And then the other thing it does is instead of just showing you relative numbers by the width of the arrows, it gives you actual numbers. So we have 2.2 million people brought into Southeast Brazil here as slaves. 1.5 million people into Bahia, over 800,000 people in Pernambuco, and so on. Okay, and once again, same thing with the Caribbean here. We've got over 1 million people just in this small island of Jamaica. All right, and then into North America, we've got about 22,000 people on the Gulf Coast, just over 200,000 people in the Carolinas and Georgia. 128,000 in the Chesapeake, and 27,000 people to the northern part of the United States. All right. So this map is, and then it has a separate breakout over here showing the different islands of the Caribbean. So this map is just a lot more detailed, and as I said, I hope you can see it on a computer there. Okay. Now, your textbook talks about the somewhat controversial issue about numbers. Okay, how many people were enslaved? And as it tells you, exact numbers, we don't know. Okay, but we have a pretty good estimate. And this is an estimate from a website called slavevoyages.org. We're going to read something from this website next week as well. This is, let me find the page number. This is the, what your textbook talks about in, oh, let me find it here. I can't find it right offhand. I can't find it. Sorry. It talks in here I just read this. I actually read the textbook. It talks in here about a CD-ROM, which you probably don't even know what that is anymore. It's a compact disc with data on it, where this group of scholars created a database to study the Atlantic slave trade, and that's a source of a lot of our information about the Atlantic slave trade. I'll have to look that up. I'll have to find it. Where is it? That isn't here. Oh, here it is. It's on page 165. Okay, it talks about the Atlantic slave trade ascents. No, it says David Eltis released a CD-ROM in 1999 with a data set on it. Okay, estimate the total number of enslaved Africans involved in the Atlantic slave trade was about 12.5 million. Okay, there we go. Well, they've updated that since 1999. You would hope so, right? And it's now available online, as everything is, right? And it's this website here called slavevoyages.org. It is an incredible online database, which includes information on, I think it's about 38,000 slave ship voyages. Okay? And based on that database, then, they can have what I think are fairly accurate estimates. And so once again, as your textbook says here on page 165, their estimate, this is a group of scholars who worked on this, is about 12.5 million Africans embarked from Africa. What does embarked mean? That means put on ships on the African coast. Okay, 12.5 million. Okay, they also estimate the number disembarked, or the number who make it alive to the other side, at 10.7 million. Okay? So what does that mean? Well, you know what? Hold on. Let me get my calculator. Okay. We've got 12.5 million minus 10.7 is a difference of 1.8. That means that's a mortality rate. The percent of people put on ships on the African coast who don't make it to the other side, who died along the way, is 14.4%. Okay? It was, as they tell you in here, it was higher earlier. The first 100 or so years, the mortality rate was up over 20%. But Europeans got a little smarter and learned that they had to carry food and water and things like that. So, they got more efficient, brutally efficient, really, at carrying enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. So the mortality rate actually goes down over time. But the overall average then is 14% of the 14.4% of the people put on ships are going to die before they get to the other side. Now that's not the total mortality, because that doesn't account for people who died in Africa, for example, before they even got on the ships, or were killed in violence, leading their enslavement. We'll talk about some of that stuff for next week. But this is just on dealing with the voyage across, which is often known as the Middle Passage. Okay? Okay. This shows the increase in the Atlantic slave trade over time, starting here in about 1500, 1550, 1600, and you see the numbers down here are relatively low. And they're going to stay relatively low until certainly after 1650, but really after 1700. And then they zoom up. And they're going to stay very high till about 1850, and then they drop off. There's one last little peak over here, and then they stop. So the Atlantic slave trade as a whole goes on for about 450 years, but the major years of it are from 1700 to 1850, once again. And you can see that on this graph here pretty clearly. Okay? Why does this happen? Well, your textbook talks about this, talks about demand for labor in the Americas, why Africans, why not Europeans, why not Indian, Native Americans, and so on. And you know, and what they have to say is all true. But really, the number one reason that the Atlantic slave trade happens is sugar. 90% of all the enslaved Africans taken across the Atlantic labored on sugar plantations. That's one of the reasons why, as I said, North America was kind of a minor part of what was going on. The major crops in North America were, well, in the Chesapeake area, it was tobacco. In the Carolinas and Georgia, it was rice and indigo. And then in the what becomes known as the Deep South, it becomes cotton, but only after 1790. So sugar is the driving force of what's going on, well, for a couple reasons. One is massive numbers of sugar plantations, but also the mortality rate on sugar plantations is going to be very high. Basically, people living on sugar plantations will live an average of about 5 years. 40% of them will die in the first year, actually. And so they need the plantation owners and people running plantations have to keep buying slaves to replace the people who died. Plus, plus if they want to expand, then they need more labor as well. So the demand for labor from sugar plantations is just going to keep increasing throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Once again, that's not the case once again, if you studied U.S. history, that's not the case in North America. Mortality rates in the U.S. or North America and what becomes the U.S. were much lower. And so much so that in North America, you end up with a slave population that actually increases just through natural reproduction. Well, that's not the case on a sugar plantation. Okay, the example would be Jamaica. Just over 1 million slaves were taken into Jamaica over a period of the Atlantic slave trade. At the end of that period, there were about 300,000 there. So you start with 1 million and end up with 300,000. Obviously, that's no increase at all, right? Obviously. In North America, on the other hand, there's about 400,000. I think enslaved Africans are brought to those areas that become the United States. And then by 1860, just before the Civil War, there's a population of 4 million. So you have a natural increase over time. Now, I'm not saying, oh, slavery was better in the U.S. No, I'm not saying that. Slavery sucks everywhere, okay? I'm writing a book right now about this community of slaves in West Africa who, you would think, relatively speaking, have it pretty good. They get paid wages. They get their food provided and housing and clothing and all this other stuff. But they're still slaves, and it sucks. Okay, not having your freedom is just a horrible way to live. So that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that it was healthier in North America. I'm not saying that made it better. Okay, some people will argue that actually made it worse because you got more to lose. So either way, there's no good aspects about slavery. Okay. But to emphasize that sugar is the driving force of what's going on, then the sugar plantation becomes sort of the quintessential unit of enslavement. And sugar plantations develop in Asia, and especially this part of the Eastern Mediterranean right here by the 12th century. And the European Crusaders travel there. Become introduced both to sugar itself, which they didn't really have before. They only had natural sweeteners like honey or fruit juice and so on. But they're introduced to sugar. They like it, and then they start growing it. And so they start developing sugar plantations across parts of the Mediterranean here. And then even on up into parts of Europe itself, like Spain and Portugal here. Okay? But initially, these plantations will use slave labor but it's not African labor. It's slaves from around the Mediterranean, but mostly from this area of the Black Sea, especially right up here, what is today actually Ukraine and Belarus and so on. But what happens in, I think it's 1453, is you have the rise of the Ottoman Empire, and they close off this slave trade from the Black Sea area. And Europeans then, controlling these sugar plantations, have to look someplace else for labor. Where are they going to look? They're going to look to Africa. Right? And that demand for labor then, it corresponded with their voyages of exploration down the West African coast. And the two then went together. So you'll have sugar plantations, as I said, in Spain and Portugal here, and then in these offshore islands that the Spanish and the Portuguese will discover later. The Canary Islands, Madeira, and then down here to Sao Tome, until the whole system then gets transferred across the Atlantic. First to Brazil, and then on up to other parts of South America, the Caribbean, and then even for a time in the southern U.S., right in the area of Louisiana. Louisiana and Florida are the only areas really where you can grow much sugar in the United States. Anyway, so as I said, U.S. isn't going to be a major part of things here. But it's the sugarcane system then, the sugar plantation system, that's going to be the driving force of what's going on. Now, two reasons why mortality rates are so much higher on sugar plantations. One is sugar grows best in tropical sort of environments. And those are also the places where there's going to be more tropical diseases. But also sugar is a very labor-intensive crop. Right? It's much worse than tobacco or cotton or even rice. Mostly because sugar plantations during the harvest period are going to be running about 24 hours a day. Slaves will be working, in some cases, 20 hours a day. They'll get a few hours sleep, and then they're back at it again. It's a brutal system, and it's one that essentially works people to death. Okay? So, you know, sugar, as I said, is a driving force of what's happening, but it's also a driving force in the mortality, and that makes it also a driving force in the continuation or the expansion of the slave trade over time. Okay? Let me see here. This was, as I said, an illustration of the triangular trade. Usually people talk about, you know, ship leaving Europe, going down to someplace in West Africa, conducting trade, going across to the Americas, maybe the Caribbean or the United States, and then coming back to Europe. That's a depiction of the system as a whole, but it didn't always operate that way. You also had shipping and trade that went back and forth directly from Europe to West Africa, back and forth, from West Africa to, say, North America, back and forth this way, and from North America to Europe, back and forth this way. Right? So what you know, if you heard about it, the triangular trade, that's a depiction of the overall system. That doesn't mean any one ship necessarily takes part in each one of these. It's really it's a system, once again, that lasts for 450 years. So it's complicated. There's a lot of changes over time, and it wasn't always the same at any one point in time. Okay, let me go back to the issue of the commodity trade. Okay, because what we're going to see also is the slave trade increases over time. Okay, and then will gradually decline until it disappears here about 1860 or so. But the commodity trade never goes away. It continues. It just stays about the same until after the end of the slave trade. Then it's going to boom, and we'll deal with that in a couple of weeks. Anyway, but as I said, you have a very good depiction of that commodity trade, I think, with the English of Benin reading. Okay, it also helps to explain, I think, why until at the time period that reading covers, the Africans are in charge of what happens in Africa. Okay, if you read that source carefully, what you see is the English showing up in West Africa. It's called the English of Benin, right? So it's the English showing up to the Kingdom of Benin, and they show up, and the king is sitting there, and a bunch of guys look like me show up, right? Okay, what's he going to say? He's going to say, "Who are you?" I'm going to say, "Oh, we're the English," right? And he says, "What are you doing here?" And they're going to say, "We want to trade." And he's going to say, "Well, what do you got?" And they have to show him, and he's going to show what he's got, and so on, okay? But the point there is he's in charge. He is a king, after all. There's very few Europeans, and they can never outnumber Africans. So if the Africans are going to be in charge of what happens along the African coast. And as I said, in the early years, and what you see in that reading, that's going to be the commodity trade. All right, so the slave trade will certainly come later, and I emphasize that some in this reading. We'll talk about it again next week as well in a little more detail. Next week we're going to focus a little more on what happens within Africa, but the commodity trade is important, and that's one thing I don't particularly like about this this chapter in your textbook. I don't like the way it starts, because it starts with this story about the Portuguese going down to Africa and kidnapping Africans, which is true and which happened. But it happened mostly in these early years of the 15th century, and it didn't happen at a large scale. Okay? Europeans did not kidnap 12.5 million people. Okay? It's just impossible. If you believe that, then you believe that Africans were, what, dumb enough to let 12 million people get kidnapped? No, of course not. Nor are they so weak as to allow 12 million people to get kidnapped by Europeans. That's not the way it happened. Okay? How did it happen? Well, that's what we'll talk about next week when we look at things going on within Africa. Okay? Thanks very much.